Thank you very much, Steve. Many points I have now written down to come back to later, personally and in the Q&A. Next, I'd like to introduce to you a pair of visitors that have come all the way up from Cambridge, Massachusetts today. I'm going to read you their bios first and then give you their talk introduction, if you don't mind. And Adrienne, I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your last name. Raphel, thank you very much. We'll start with you. Adrienne Raphel was raised in southern New Jersey and northern Vermont. Don't forget, it's right next door. She received a BA from Princeton University and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a teaching writing fellow. Currently, she is a PhD candidate in English at Harvard University, where she studies poetics and plays word games. She is also a regular writer for the New Yorker Online. In addition, her essays and poetry have appeared in the Paris Review Daily, the Atlantic, the Lana Turner Journal, and Poetry Northwest, among other publications. Rachel was a graduate of the University of Iowa's How Writers Write Poetry online course. She has worked as the instructor of the Harvard X MOOC Poetry in America, led by Professor Lisa New, and continues to work on related Poetry in America initiatives as a digital fellow in the Harvard Department of English. Also joining her will be Emily Silk. Emily Silk is also a PhD student in English at Harvard, where she studies 19th century American literature and culture. After graduating in 2010 from Princeton University, she spent 3 years in K-12 public education as a research analyst and program manager at City Bridge Foundation in Washington, D.C., where she focused on strategies for school implementation of online and blended learning programs. I want to talk more with you about that. We have a lot to learn from K-12. Okay, sorry. Silk has worked as an instructor on the Harvard X MOOC Poetry in America course as well, also led by Professor Lisa New, in case you forgot from the last bio. And she continues to work on related Poetry in America initiatives also as a digital fellow in the Harvard Department of English. They're going to speak with you today on designing and teaching literary MOOCs. And this is reflections from their course, Poetry in America. So come on up and join us, please. Thank you. We should have source. Great.
Excellent. So hello, good afternoon. Adrienne and I are so excited to be here as part of a conversation on a topic that we have both become really passionate about. So we wanted to start just by thanking everyone who's involved in creating this event, and especially thanking Jed for inviting us to join you today. So Adrienne and I are here today representing Poetry in America, which is a Harvard X MOOC that launched in the fall of 2013. Poetry in America is the brainchild of Harvard English professor Lisa New, who leads the course and whose vision really has guided it from the beginning. Lisa has also been kind of an incredible mentor to both of us, so we're pretty excited to be representing that work today. So Ellen kind of shared our bios, and of course we went to the same undergraduate institution. We're both Harvard PhDs. We kind of like to think of ourselves as academic twins. We've known each other for almost 10 years now. We think this is going to work in our favor today because, in fact, we're going to tag team this presentation. So we're going to move back and forth, hopefully in a manner that appears wonderfully. So Lisa brought both of us on to Poetry in America as part of the teaching team in the 2014-15 school year, this past school year. And our job within the MOOC is really all about generating conversation. So we were brought on to design the discussion questions that are going to provoke engagement with the texts, and then to push and pull and provoke still further as discussion forum moderators. So we're essentially about everything that happens after the students go in and watch Lisa's videos on Walt Whitman or on Emily Dickinson. We're about kind of extending that learning through dialogue. So since this is the perspective that we bring, we thought we would spend today sharing some of what we've learned through doing this course and a lot of what we haven't learned, and some of the things that have really worked for us and some of the things that haven't worked for us, and try to give you, I think, really an on-the-ground reflection on the experience of Poetry in America. So that's going to be our goal for the next 20-odd minutes.
So we thought it'd be helpful to start with a quick orientation to what the Poetry in America MOOC looks like. Poetry in America surveys the history of American poetry from the Puritans all the way through contemporary hip hop. The course is organized into modules of 4 to 6 weeks each, and these modules are intended to work both as standalone courses and as part of a larger sequence. To date, we've run 5 of these modules. So the Poetry of Early New England, which launched in fall 2014, followed by Nature and Nation, which is poetry from about 1700 to 1850. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and then Poetry of the Civil War and its aftermath. And we're really excited. We're going to be launching Module 6 in spring 2016, which is on modernism. Poetry of New England and Whitman also ran as pilot modules in 2013 and early 2014. So the student experience of each module is fairly consistent. Each week, you read a set of assigned poems and watch video content featuring Lisa, often in conversation with various guest speakers. They also participate in 2 kinds of direct engagement. So they annotate poems using an online annotation tool. So here's a screenshot of what that looks like. And then they post brief written responses to poems in discussion forums. We'll talk more about both of these in a few moments. The course content and structure is guided by 3 overarching core beliefs. Poetry in America is all about dialogue. So this is Professor New with students. Much of the video content for the course is filmed as conversation rather than as lecture, and the actual active work of the course is heavily interactive. So Poetry in America also emphasizes the interdisciplinarity of poetry. So here's Lisa with Elena Kagan. We want students who take the course to feel that poetry transcends disciplines. Lisa's videos feature her in conversation with a variety of guests from the worlds of art, government, sports, music. There's a strong emphasis on the value of different perspectives. So the idea that a poetry professor and an NBA basketball player, for instance, Jason Collins, can bring something valuable to the table when talking about Emily Dickinson, for example. Finally, we're into the power of place. So our course takes a somewhat historical perspective in exploring poetry. We benefit greatly from the opportunity that an online course creates for virtual travel. We've been able to film a lot of our videos at locations relevant to the poems and poets we study. So the virtual field trips bring us into the homes of Dickinson, Emerson, to the banks of the East River, Whitman's Brooklyn print shop. So you're reading, crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and you're crossing Brooklyn Ferry. We also want to give a quick sense of who it is that's taking Poetry in America, pulling data from edX's course analytics. We're going to illustrate using our data from Dickinson, but this is basically applicable across all the modules. So age, the peak enrollment is clustered in like the 25-year-old to 35-year-old range. I'm just going to scroll through these pretty quickly. Gender, it's skewed more female. Dickinson was 65-35. Whitman was a little more equitable. Enrollment by education, about a quarter of our students have high school diplomas or less, a little over a third of college diploma, and then a little over a third have advanced degrees. And we've had course enrollment, so we've had more people register for Poetry in America almost every module, and Dickinson brought us to our peak of about 13,000 students from 144 different countries, which has really interesting implications for the discussion elements of our course.
So that then brings us to our main focus, which is kind of those on-the-ground reflections from the experience of running the MOOC. And as I mentioned earlier, the place where we really have the most leverage is in developing those discussion questions and then pushing, facilitating the conversation that comes out of them. So we thought we'd organize our reflections around those 2 prongs. We'll think a little bit about design, and then we'll think a little bit about facilitation. So here we go on design, on the assignments that we create for our students. So the first bit of active engagement that students have is with what we call our Annotation Tool. And this is a HarvardX tool originally developed in-house for use on our course. And Harvard has now expanded the tool, made it compatible with a number of other platforms, including Canvas, so that it can be piloted in face-to-face classrooms. And that's happening in a few classrooms this fall. So a nice moment of kind of technology transferring back into the face-to-face context. The broad goal of the tool is really simple. It's to induce close reading. More specifically, we're really interested in getting students to hone in and observe and tag formal poetic elements. So this is alliteration, this is meter, this is anaphora. And then also to explain how those elements are functioning, what they're doing within the larger poem. So we're actually going to scroll into the course. This is an example prompt from our Walt Whitman module. We're asking students to look at section 52 of Song of Myself. And Adrienne is going to walk us through while I talk us through this part. So to respond to the prompt, basically what you do is you highlight the text that you would like to annotate. A little box pops up, and you can add a tag. So you can add rhythm or metaphor. There are a number of tags preloaded. You can also make up your own. And then you type your comment in the comment box. You can also add a link or a picture if you would like to. We also provide sample staff annotations. So if you're having trouble getting started, you can switch to the instructor view. There are some staff pre-populated notes that you can read to get you going. We think the annotation tool is a really powerful part of the course. It's the one time we're sure that students are physically marking up the poems. And it raises cool implications, we think, for what crowdsourcing poetry analysis can look like, right? So what does this virtual piece of paper look like when hundreds of us have all marked it up together? All of that being said, the tool is continuously a work in progress, and we've learned a couple of things about it over the course of its lifetime. So one is that, and this should come as no surprise, functionality and aesthetics both really, really matter. So when we first launched the tool in our beta course, it had pretty limited functionality. We actually had a whole discussion forum called Annotation Tool Woes. And there were a lot of woes in that forum. Over time, the course team has steadily improved the tool. We've also improved the apparatus around the tool. So we've added FAQs, we've added a how-to video, we've added an explanation of the pedagogy behind annotation, which was really key. And so we found that as we explained the hows and whys more fully, people became more willing to engage with the tool. And actually, the quality of the annotations that we were seeing also kind of went up. The functionality still isn't perfect. What Adrienne is scrolling through right now is the public view, which is all of the annotations that everyone in the course has made. And there, you can scroll for quite some time there. And the public view can be overwhelming. As course staff, we actually don't have the capacity to moderate and check the annotation responses. There's a reply function where the students can respond to one another, but we actually think it's underutilized in the course. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that this view is very overwhelming, right? Where do you as a student start when you're trying to respond to all of these different annotations? So while this is a kind of crowdsourcing, it's still not a completely fluid conversation. And two, and this is a pedagogical point, the nature of the tool can lend itself to tagging without analysis, right? So we have some students who will say, this is a metaphor, but won't then follow up and explain what that means. And that's great, that's good, that's halfway there, but it's not all the way. And so we are still figuring out how exactly to encourage that kind of commentary across the board with the tool, which I think in a certain sense we've been more successful doing through the discussion forums.
So that's where I'm going to jump in and talk about the discussion forums. This is really the second kind of active engagement that we've designed for students. And so each discussion forum kind of offers a big question about a single poem. We ask students to post a brief response and then to comment on at least 2 other students' work. So here you can see one. We also have what we call open response forums, where students write a 2-paragraph essay that is often comparative, making an argument based on multiple poems. So here we can see this is kind of what a discussion forum looks like. The goals of the discussion forums are similar to those of the Annotation Tool. We want students to close read single poems, focus on drawing together formal and thematic elements. But the discussion forum is different in that it asks students to take a stance, make an argument. This is a thread that from our Whitman module, from Song of Myself, section 6, and it generated actually a lot of really good back and forth and kind of really thoughtful responses, you can see. We've learned a few interesting lessons over time here, though, about what kinds of prompts generate responses that are both enthusiastic and rigorous. The MOOC environment was really great for this. In an in-class discussion, if you ask something and you get crickets, you can real-time kind of shift and rephrase the question. But online, we had to get that question right the first time. Let's see. I'm going to switch back quickly into this. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Here we go. So in our early modules, we tended to give short, open-ended 1 to 2 sentence prompts. This is our best official thread titled Day of Doom. It's just the title of the poem. But you can see this question is just kind of really short, very brief, and it opened the door to more thematic, affective responses that didn't directly address the actual text. As we progressed, we realized that giving students a more robust prompt with multi-level questions encouraged more thoughtful, analytical, close readings. Since we weren't there to prompt the students in real time, we had to signal more upfront about the kinds of things we were looking for, baking what might be follow-ups in a face-to-face discussion into the actual questions. So we wanted to show, for an example of that, a discussion of Dickinson's variants. Here, the prompt is more tightly structured than in Whitman, and students engage quite deeply with the text. Our Dickinson discussion boards were particularly fruitful because the Emily Dickinson Archive, a rich online resource that provides direct access to Dickinson manuscripts, offered us the opportunity to have students analyze primary sources. We had them looking at manuscripts almost every week. Not only did they love this, but it forced real attention to the text. Questions about Dickinson's variants, for instance, got them thinking on the level of individual word choice in a way that other modules and prompts never had. This is certainly a testament to Dickinson as a poet who really rewards close reading, but we also think that primary sources are particularly good in a MOOC setting for pushing close textual attention. Finally, we also experimented with creative prompts, asking students to write their own poems in the style of, say, Whitman or Dickinson. These prompts sparked a lot of excitement from students, some of whom revised their poems multiple times. But they have a different role than, say, creative responses in a workshop-oriented MOOC like the one I worked on at Iowa, where the goal was more to actively criticize and analyze others' poems. The creative prompts in our MOOC are really about celebrating and enjoying language, which is something we've come to value a lot as a teaching team.
So speaking of language, the second kind of big piece of our role, to which we've already alluded, is facilitating discussion, and these are paper posts, even though we're talking about digital posts. There are two major categories of things we think a lot about. One is kind of the quantity, the amount of facilitation that we can and should be doing as moderators, and the other is kind of the quality of discussion that's coming out of that facilitation. So I'll talk a little bit about quantity first. To give you a sense of the numbers, on any given week, we have 3 Harvard PhD students moderating a total of about 9 different forums on individual poems, which means that each of us is moderating 3 different forums, and then in any given forum, there's 50 to 200 posts, plus reply posts from students responding to one another. And while we read as many as possible, right, we don't have the capacity to respond to all of them, and we know this is not an issue unique to our MOOC, and we're really interested in how others are dealing with thinking about these capacity questions. We find ourselves focusing most on the posts to which students have clearly devoted a lot of time and effort, and the posts that are students really reaching out asking for help. I don't know even where to start with this poem. And we also find ourselves oscillating between trying to craft, these beautiful 2 to 3 paragraph responses that address a number of posts within an individual thread, versus crafting 2 to 3 sentence quick responses that ask a question prompted by an individual post. We also try to disperse our attention across time, right? So one quirk of our platform is that only the first 25 posts will load, unless you scroll to the bottom and you click a button that says load more posts, which means that universally the first 25 students who post get the most feedback from their peers. So we try to be sure that we are commenting to posts on all levels, all days, when students could be posting, and particularly towards the end of the list. That said, anecdotally speaking, students do generally seem satisfied with the amount of feedback that we are able to give. As we grew in size, particularly as we reached our Dickinson module, which was our largest one, we did have students reach out to us and say, we're actually really hungry for more feedback than you all are giving us. And especially our students who had been with us since the Puritans, since our very first module. And we're used to having much more individualized attention. And so we've experimented with a few different strategies to develop the feedback loop to keep the community feeling tight. One of the first things we tried was office hours. We actually tried these office hour chat rooms in our earlier modules. And they were surprisingly unpopular in our course. They didn't get a lot of traction, not a lot of visitors, and nobody complained when we dropped them from the later modules. So we'd be really curious to hear about others' experiences with office hours. In our Dickinson module specifically, which was when we started to hear from the students who were really hungry for more feedback, one fix that we attempted, we actually asked for 2 to 3 volunteers to be community TAs, community moderators. And community TAs in that module, we had a few great folks join us, and they really helped to keep the dialogue focused, to keep it sustained. They also seemed to enjoy doing it. But we know that this isn't really a long-term replacement for staff capacity, and we're still trying to figure out how to crack that nut. And then finally in Dickinson, we encouraged people to develop smaller sub-community threads. Like some of them, like the Lifelong Learners thread, got a lot of traction. People really found a home in that thread, and there were a lot of posts. Others, we had one started by a high school student interested in getting other young learners involved, didn't pick up as much traction. So we think that these were moderately successful. One of the things that they did do was allow people to find one another within the larger community, which I think overall was a net positive.
And so in addition to the quantity of discussion, a thing we also thinking a lot about is the quality of our discussion. So discussion forums are really great because you can craft and edit your response, but it's sometimes very hard to get a sustained dialogue going. Some of our students are incredibly engaged and they become really strong voices in these forums. Others are actively reading but rarely posting, and then others don't post at all. And we're totally okay with that. We encourage people to engage with the course in whatever way best suits their needs. But we do want to make this space rich and robust so that more and more people feel empowered to contribute and our conversations become as clearly navigable and welcoming as possible. So here are some ideas that we've had looking forward. We're interested in emphasizing the skills-based aspect of poetry analysis more fully. We found it really tricky to teach the formal elements of poetry through our existing set of tools. So for instance, we found students like this one curious but uninformed about meter. And we tried responding to a few of these individual questions, but that resulted in long, labor-intensive posts that only got seen by a few people. Like this one. One of our colleagues wrote this beautiful, very long response to this cry for help about meter, got totally buried in a thread, only maybe a few people saw it. We then tried writing and filming video tutorials on Meter, but students never then got the opportunity to practice in any real way. We might take a page from courses looking forward that use comprehension check quizzes. If we could build some kind of rhythm and Meter practice tool or assessment into the course, we might be able to build more rigorous skills development without losing our emphasis on discussion. We also wanted to work on sustained returning engagement with a single poem. We might start asking questions that make students return to the same text again and again, so fewer poems but more depth. We're also thinking about how moderators might be more of a guiding force in the forums, perhaps opening and closing discussions with statements that synthesize student reflections. Finally, one thought we had looking forward, this is kind of an in our dreams moment. You know those blockbuster sci-fi movies where there's a scene of the computer person who moves around different screens in the air with her hands, or like with Tom Cruise's hands? So we'd love to be able to figuratively detach posts from their places in the thread and put together clusters of dialogue with one another. So like you over here are thinking about this, and you're thinking about this, and like let's get you all thinking together in the same space. So we'd create little clouds that people know exactly who they're talking to.
So those are just some initial reflections. As we look towards our next module, I think we'll be looking to incorporate some of these ideas and hopefully some of the ideas that we're all talking about today into the course. So for now, we'll just say thanks again for having us, and we're eager to keep talking in the Q&A.